It's quite common for a musical to change itself throughout the years. Most shows have a preview period where they will change a couple of details here, there and everywhere. Some shows will change themselves through a revival, or even after a Broadway run that didn't go successfully, something like the Addams Family musical. But the musical version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is one of the shows that has changed the most since it first opened in London's West End in 2013. Since then, we have had three very contrasting versions of the show. The 2013 London version, the Broadway version, and now the most recent UK tour that just opened in Leeds. This is a video that I wanted to make for a very long time, and I was about to, and then they announced that the UK tour would be opening, and that they were changing the show once again, so I've waited, and now I've seen all three versions. I can give my thoughts, and properly contrast and compare every version of the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory musical. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Today we are going to discuss as many changes as humanly possible, and I'm going to give my thoughts on which versions work best and why the changes might have been made. But if you haven't seen my face before, hi, I'm Ellie. I talk about theatre, I do reviews, I do discussions, and sometimes, very rarely, I do things like this. So if any of that sounds interesting to you and you want to see more videos like this, please consider hitting like and subscribing. We're so close to 2,000 subscribers on the channel, which is... it's beautiful. I can smell the 2,000 subscribers like a fragrant bar of chocolate. But, with all that said, let's start talking about the differences. With our openings, Broadway is our outlier in this situation. The West End version and the UK tour version both start with Charlie in a junkyard, as they collect pieces of trash to repurpose to help their family. We then get the opening number for both of our UK versions, which is almost nearly perfect. The Broadway version, however, cuts this number and instead places in Candyman from the original Gene Wilder film. We have to talk about this a little bit because the American version of this show seems very reliant on the nostalgia of the original Gene Wilder film. Now, I think the reason behind this is I think the Broadway producers were a little bit worried that people were going to come and see this musical and expect to see the Gene Wilder film on Broadway. However, here in the UK, that isn't really the most popular version of the story. Don't get me wrong, it's popular, a lot of people know it, but equally as popular is the original book here. So, with this, we kind of end up with the UK version only taking one song from the film, however the US version taking pretty much as it could take. I'm not sure how well Candyman fits into this show stylistically. We lose the opening number almost nearly perfect, which I feel like sums up Charlie so perfectly. They are in poverty, they are down on their luck, but they're so grateful to have what they have. It's a sweet number that really does tell you everything you need to know about Charlie, and I am using gender-neutral language here because of an interesting change that the UK tour version made most recently, which was to open up the casting of the role of Charlie to both young boys and young girls. This is a change that obviously was going to stir up a little bit of controversy because, you know, people can't deal with the slightest little bit of change in their musicals, but it's a change that doesn't really change much, except for the fact that it just opens up casting. Charlie is already a gender-neutral name, so you don't even have to change that. And all you really need to have a good Charlie is someone who brings across that sweetness, that imagination, that pureness of heart, which none of these traits are really defined by gender. I don't think this change was a stretch of the imagination at all, and I actually really enjoyed it. And I think opening up the casting to both genders was quite a nice addition, especially because the children's casting in the show is only Charlie. But we'll talk more about that later. Now, while 2 out of 3 of these productions start in the junkyard, all 3 of these shows differ on Wonka's inclusion into the start of the show. In the West End version, Charlie talks to a homeless man in the junkyard. At the end of the show, this homeless man is revealed to be Willy Wonka himself. On Broadway, they kind of shift a lot of Charlie's discussions and talks to the owner of a sweet shop, who is played by the actor who plays Willy Wonka. UK tour is the only one that doesn't have a Wonka presence at the start of the show. All of these lines originally said by the actor playing Wonka are given to Mrs. Pratchett, who is a different owner of the sweet shop, and in the original West End version brought on a little sweet trolley at the start of the show. I've always quite liked this twist, and although my problems with the Broadway change, it still continues to imply what I enjoy about this, which is that Wonka has known about Charlie for a long time, and Wonka might even be the reason that they get the ticket in the first place. Charlie returns to their family. These characters are basically the same. We have Charlie's 4 grandparents: Grandpa Joe, Grandma Josephine, Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, and Charlie's mother. In both the West End version and the book, Charlie has 2 parents alive, and both have a presence. The tragedy comes from the fact that both of these parents are having to work at opposite times, so they never actually get to see each other, and they never actually get to co-parent together. Broadway and the UK tour both cut the father in slightly different ways, which we will discuss later. I know I'm saying a lot of stuff is saved for later, but don't worry, we will get to it. An interesting addition to the UK tour version, however, is because of the fact that the person who's playing Charlie's mother is hard of hearing, they actually add sign language to the show. And when they're in the house, all of the family members use sign language to talk with Charlie's mother. It's such a little bit of inclusion, but it's such a sweet little thing. In both the West End and the UK tour version, we learn about Willy Wonka through Charlie's grandparents and the song The Amazing Fantastical History of Willy Wonka, which is a very Roald Dahl title of a song. The West End version of this song is a lot more upbeat, whereas the UK tour version I actually like a little bit more because it feels a little bit slower. It feels a little bit more like a story that your grandparents would tell you. And it's staged in a really interesting way. Broadway took this song and replaced it with the song Willy Wonka, Willy Wonka, which must have taken ages to think of a title for. This song reframes it, and instead it's about Charlie telling the sweet shop owner about Willy Wonka, which I understand why they made this change. It shows a little bit more of Charlie, especially because they cut Almost Nearly Perfect, but I think that having the story told by the grandparents gives Charlie and them a little bit more time bonding. An element that's very important when you remember that it's Grandpa Joe who will later go on to take Charlie around the factory. As you can probably tell, it's very rare to find something that is exactly the same in every single production. Even if it's just the tiniest little difference, there is something. One of these rare things is the song A Letter from Charlie Bucket. In this song, Charlie writes a letter to Willy Wonka asking for a couple of different inventions that they have thought of that would help their family out. It's cute, it shows off their imagination, and becomes quite an important element to the story later. It's Chekhov's letter. Cut to next morning, and Charlie and family find out about the competition through a newspaper, and we start to meet the winners. Here we get to talk about one of the most controversial changes, a change that was made for Broadway and has actually stayed moving on into the UK tour, and that is the decision to cast the 4 bad children in the show with adult actors. Now, I can understand the rationale here. Not only does it help you when you're financing this show, you don't have to cast a group of child actors, because there's a lot of child labour laws, both in the UK and America, that help and kind of stop children from being exploited, and make sure that they are only working fair hours, and only a certain number of days a week. Which means for shows that normally include children, like School of Rock, Matilda, these shows will typically have a group of about 4 children all playing the same role. These will swap out throughout the week. But it also meant that the Broadway version felt a little bit safer to go darker and to kind of take the darker elements of the books and expand it. But some may argue that the Broadway version went too cruel. Now, I think the problem with this casting comes from the fact that, well, they don't look like kids. it's not hard to suspend your disbelief on stage. However, when they are standing next to their parents and they look about the same age, and when they're next to Charlie, it does look quite odd. The UK tour keeps this casting decision. Now, I must say, I still don't really like it for all the reasons I said before, but I can understand why on a tour you would want to cut this corner. And also, I appreciate the casting. Both Augustus Gloop and Mike Teevee are played by two trans actors. A decision and a casting choice that I really appreciate, because it's not very often that trans actors are allowed to play roles designed for cisgender people. The winner order is the same in every production. We start with Augustus Gloop. Every single production so far has kept this introduction the same, with the song More of Him to Love. Veruca Salt's song, When Veruca Says, stays the same in every single production. However, Broadway made one very big change about her character, which is where she comes from. Instead of being a upper-class English child, they move her and she becomes Russian. I personally think that it does work better when it's an upper-class English family, but I must say that the Russian version actually works a hell of a lot better than I originally thought it would. But I must also say here how it is quite weird that the Broadway version kind of takes away everything British about the show. This is kind of a trend that we see a lot, and I think it is a shame. It's very rare you see a musical go to Broadway and keep its Britishness. Matilda is a very rare exception, but the Broadway version of Charlie's Treachery doesn't only take away the Britishness from Veruca, it also takes away the Britishness from Charlie and makes Charlie American. Meaning that 3 out of 5 of the Golden Ticket winners are American. Like, come on, we didn't have the greatest diversity in the original one, 2 of them being English, 2 of them being American, and 1 being German. But that's an even worse ratio. I don't know what it is at Broadway. Why do you hate British musicals? It's like we hold up a show and we give it to America and they go, you know what, we're going to un-British your musical. Violet Beauregarde's history is actually quite interesting because they are the part of this show that has changed the most when it comes to how they're introduced and how they exit. The original West End version gave her the song Double Bubble Duchess, which is quite an interesting song with a very impressive rap section. However, just before the show closed in the West End, they replaced that song with the song Queen of Pop, a song that went to Broadway and continues to stay into the show in the UK tour version. Another small change to mention about Violet Beauregarde is she is actually the one child who's had the gender of their parent changed. Although both the West End and the Broadway version kept Mr. Beauregard, the new UK tour version actually follows the Johnny Depp film and gives us Mrs. Beauregard. And also, actually in the book, all of their children have 2 parents come into the factory with them, except for Charlie. So with that, none of the adaptations have been book accurate. And finally, there's Mike Teevee. Mike Teevee's exit has stayed the exact same, but the introduction has been through a lot. The West End version had the song It's TV Time, which is a very weird song, and I don't quite get it, and it's probably one of the weaker pieces of the original West End score. And rightfully so, Broadway changed this to a song called What Could Possibly Go Wrong, which is very, like, American, and I quite like it. It's fine. I still have similar problems with it, but it worked. And then, when the US tour came about, yes, there's another version of the show we have to mention. They decided to change it again for a song called That Little Man of Mine. Now, the UK tour has gone, do you know what? It's time to change it once again, and has reverted back to the original West End version. However, the song is now called the Teevee Family. Each of these introductions are watched by Charlie. However, in the UK versions, they are watched by Charlie and the family, but the Broadway version changed this so that Charlie watched all of these along with the Candyman. Yet again, losing more of that time that we spend getting to know Charlie's family. Talking about family, at this point, 4 tickets are gone and Charlie is at their lowest. They are consoled by their parent, parents. The West End version had the father do this, and eventually fail, leading into the song If Your Mother Was Here. In the West End version, this is a duet. The first part of the song is taken up by the father, and then he goes to work and the mother comes in, and the second part of it is If Your Father Were Here. The Broadway version ends up cutting the father, who does make a small appearance in this song as like a background dancer. And I do like the emotional beat of the father being gone, and I like the emotions that come from this. However, I still quite like the original West End version. I understand how making it a single parent would add a kind of emotional beat, but the fact that these people are so close to each other, yet so far because of their financial standing in life, rings quite true for a lot of parents. In the UK tour version, they completely cut this song, which I must say is one of the biggest missteps. And instead, it's replaced with Candyman. Yes, the UK tour version keeps Candyman, but it's in a slightly different place. We can talk about how stylistically this doesn't work. I've already touched on that. What I'm going to touch on the fact is that, well, this song doesn't really work because it's very American. This UK tour version is set in the UK. Specifically, it actually gives it a time period, which is hinted through the set. The first time the sweet shop opens, we see a sign on the door telling us that this musical is set during the time of the Falklands War. So referring to a sweet shop owner as a Candyman, it's very small, okay? It's nitpicky. It's very nitpicky. However, I feel like I'm justified. 4 tickets are gone. There's only one left. Charlie has lost all hope until they find a little bit of cash. In both the UK tour and the West End version, they find a little bit of money in the junkyard. However, the Broadway version kind of has Charlie steal this money, because Charlie finds it in the sweet shop, tries to return it, but the Candyman has just left. And then instead of like leaving it in a place that the Candyman might find, just goes and buys a bar of chocolate with it. Charlie, you are a liar and a thief. You do not deserve that factory. They buy the chocolate and they find the ticket. In the UK versions, this leads to the song Don't You Pinch Me Charlie, which is one of my favourites. It's so upbeat and fun. It's warm and joyful. I just love it. You can't help but tap your toe along to it. Broadway, as they do with a lot of these things, takes what they used in the original film, which I think is the song that works the least out of all of the songs that they took from the film. Because I don't think there is anyone in this world, anyone, who will look at all of the material from the Gene Wilder film, and there's a lot of good material in the Gene Wilder film, and say, yes, my favourite song from this film is I've Got a Golden Ticket. No one is saying that. Yeah, I'm very salty about this change. Thank you, UK Tour, for fixing it. And then we end Act 1 with one of the strongest songs I feel in the entire show. It Must Be Believed to Be Seen. Now, Broadway understood this, and they didn't really touch it. However, the UK Tour version has kind of blended it with a new song, which I feel weakens it a little bit. All 3 of these versions open with a type of magic trick with Willy Wonka. All of these differ in a very interesting way. The West End versions, I must be honest, is the most impressive. But let's please remember that that version had a budget. That version had a budget. The doors open, and Wonka appears as an old man. He sings a little bit, and the outfit's pulled off to reveal Wonka in a split second. Broadway does the same kind of introduction. Wonka enters as an old man. However, he falls to the floor and the crowd kind of surround him, and that's how they do this quick change from old man to Willy Wonka. It's less impressive, but it still kind of works. The UK tour goes in a different direction, and the doors open to just reveal the hat and the cane, which start to float upwards as Willy Wonka enters from behind and grabs them. It's not like the West End version the best. We get the song, the children enter the factory, do come in. Boom, end of Act 1. Yes, we are only at the end of Act 1. I told you that this was a lot to go through. Act 2 of this musical is the one that's filled with a lot more spectacle. For the Broadway and the UK tour versions, it was quite clear that they had a lot less budget than the West End version, which not only had the budget, but also had the absolutely giant theatre that is the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. Because of this, they do struggle with a lot of the location hopping and the exits of the characters, which I do think reflects a little bit into the changes that are made to the show. I haven't really been touching much on the actual direction or staging, but I felt it was important to mention this here because I feel like this is a time where the capability and the budget that they had kind of reflects what they do. Strike That Reverse It is another one of the songs that has actually been maintained through every single production, and pretty much features no minute changes. The only one that I really noticed is that there was one joke that stayed in both the West End and the Broadway versions, which wasn't seen in the UK tour version, but if that's the only change, that's so minute, and I think it just goes to prove how this works very well as an opening of Act 2 number, and your first true introduction to what Willy Wonka is like. We then find ourselves leading into the chocolate room. The West End version let the set do the talking here, and instead of having a song that leads into the room, decided to have the song a little bit later. This song is simply Second Nature. It's a nice song. I think it's one of the weaker parts of the West End score, so I understand why it's been cut in future productions. Both the Broadway and the UK tour versions have instead opted to follow the Gene Wilder film, and this is where they place Pure Imagination. It works, sure, and I think out of all the songs from the film, this is the strongest one, but I think I prefer how the West End places this a little bit later. Gloop is the first one of our children to meet their demise. We all know what happens to him. He falls into a chocolate river and starts to get sucked up the chocolate pipe. We then get another one of the rare songs that has stayed pretty much the same for every single production, and that is Auf Wiedersehen Augustus Gloop. Oh yeah, she studied German. It means goodbye. This song is sung by the Oompa Loompas, and this is where we get to touch on the most interesting element of each production. Now, I think it is quite fair to say that the Oompa Loompas are a slightly more controversial figure now. The West End and the Broadway versions are both actually surprisingly close to the book appearance. The Broadway version is actually the closest. Well, after Roald Dahl went back into the book and made them a little bit less racist. The West End Oompa Loompas are quite small but blocky, and the actor's stature is hidden a lot of the time by the costuming and the set. They are often on top of pipes doing tap dances, or if they're not hidden by that, their stature is hidden by the Oompa Loompas being on stilts and stuff. Some examples of this will be on screen now, like in the songs Juicy, and even videos where they're kind of on each other's shoulders. The Broadway Oompa Loompas, they approach it in a bit more of the Lord Farquaad way, where it's actors very clearly on their knees. The proportions look so weird. The UK tour gets away from the weird history of the Oompa Loompas, and instead makes them robots. I actually like this approach the most. I understand how this may upset some diehard fans, but I am of the opinion that if something is controversial, is it really that important that we keep it the same way? Especially because this is an adaptation. This is just one version of how someone may look at Charlie's Treachery and take the elements. And it's not an idea that completely goes against the ideas and the ideals of Charlie and the Treachery. Willy Wonka is an inventor. It makes sense that he would invent a workforce because he's so worried about people coming in and stealing his ideas. And it also adds a little bit more validity to the fact that the Oompa Loompas don't do anything to help these children, because you can kind of think, oh, well, it might not be in their program, it might not be in there if someone falls into the lake to help them. I think the more you think about Robot Oompa Loompas, the more it actually works and services the story. I decided to tell you which version of each of the child's exits is the darkest in each production. For Augustus Gloop, I feel like the UK tour is the darkest. In both the West End and Broadway versions, you don't see Augustus after he goes up the pipe. However, the UK tour version shows him turned into a giant piece of chocolate fudge in a round glass container that they start moving around the stage. It was a surprisingly dark touch when this is an element of the story that's typically kind of hidden away from you and more hinted at the fact that Augustus Gloop is probably turned into food. We move on to the mixing room next. Wonka shows off a bunch of new inventions, including the famous 3-course meal gum, which of course Violet Beauregarde steals and starts to chew, where she quickly finds the problem with the dessert. This is the exit that has changed the most. The Western version had a very disco-inspired dance number called Juicy here. Violet Beauregarde starts to expand, she runs off stage, and then soon they bring on a giant ball version of her, which kind of goes above the stage and starts spinning like a disco ball. It is camp. This is something that I'm not quite sure why they've cut it in every production after this, because when the show was in the West End, this song was one of the ones that they seemed proudest of. When they would perform numbers from the show in medleys at variety shows or charity showcases, this is one of the songs that they most often would show off. Broadway did Violet Beauregarde's exit so dirty, just so dirty, that I don't understand why. She starts to inflate, we get it in basically the same kind of style as the West End version, where she's in her jumpsuit and it starts to expand, and she runs off stage, but there's no song. Instead of a song for Violet Beauregarde, they do the backstory of the Oompa Loompas in a song that I do not like. At the end of that number, which randomly comes in the show and kind of distracts us from everything else, Mr. Beauregarde runs back on stage holding a giant inflated version of Violet Beauregarde, which one of the Oompa Loompas proceeds to blow a dart at, which explodes her all over her father. Yeah, she's dead. Straight up dead. Broadway version's the darkest. I don't even need to talk about the UK tour. Broadway version's the darkest. In the UK tour version, they've added yet another new song for Violet Beauregarde's exit. I mean, I'm just thankful that they didn't cut it as usual, but I still kind of do miss Juicy. I don't understand why it was cut, and I would love to talk to the creative team about why this is a song that didn't stay between each production. Honestly, I'd love to talk to the UK tour team if they're up for this. But this new song is kind of set in a basketball court. It's called You Got What You Want, which feels like a title of a song more for Veruca Salt than it does Violet Beauregarde, but it works better than Broadway. I know I said how shocking the explosion of Violet Beauregarde was for the Broadway version, however, every single production has her explode in one way or another. Both the West End and the UK tour versions are smart to do this off stage, so we don't really know the extent to how much she's exploded. But just for the absolute brutality of just seeing the body of Violet Beauregarde in pieces and like that's the darkest. The UK version's dead question mark. The Broadway version, dead full stop. Talking about death, if you are familiar with the Broadway version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you know what's coming next. And if you don't, strap yourselves in. Wonka takes the group to the nut room, where giant squirrels are sorting out nuts, determining whether they are a good nut or a bad nut. All three versions have the same song, Veruca's Nutcracker Suite, and follow the same kind of concept. Veruca wants a squirrel, Wonka says no, Veruca tries to get the squirrel, it finds out they're a bad nut, and we get the song. Seems normal enough so far, yeah? In the book, both films, although the Gene Wilder film does do it with goose eggs instead of nuts and squirrels, the West End version and the UK tour both Veruca and her father fall down the bad nut chute, along with all the other garbage. But for some unknown reason, Broadway decided that they needed to do something a bit darker. I have spent a lot of this video describing, but I think Veruca's exit is so shocking that I have to just show it to you for yourself.
Her valley career is looking grim as we tear her apart from ear to ear.
Yep. They decide to literally tear her apart on stage. She is dead. She straight up dead. Look, the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is dark. The book is dark. The films are dark. It is a very dark story. But did no one on the production team think this was a little bit too much? And now are you understanding why they might have cast adults in this version? I think it's obvious which one's the darkest. Out of all the departures, I think My TV's is probably the most consistent throughout all three productions. TV room, he shrinks himself down to tiny size to go into the TV. We get the song Vidiots, which stays in every single production, and the ending for Mike and his mother is very funny. It's different to the book, because in the book and the Johnny Depp film, we find out that they stretch Mike TV so that he becomes the size of a normal boy again. However, he is like really stick thin. The musical version, however, has Mike TV's mum be really happy and really relaxed that Mike TV is once again baby sized, and she just puts him in her handbag. It's camp. It's camp. Out of all the endings, it's probably the strongest one. Because they're all the same, I think all of them are about the same level of darkness. So I'm just going to put draw for this one. And as you can tell, Broadway is the darkest. Finally, we are left with Grandpa Joe and Charlie. I'm quite surprised for the fact that they kept on trying to take stuff from the original film, that the fizzy lifting drink scene actually isn't to be found in any of these versions. Obviously, the fizzy lifting drink scene was something that was written for the Gene Wilder film. It's not something that appears in the book. And I'm glad they didn't put it in because I think it contrasts Charlie's character a little bit too much. Especially this version of Charlie, who's a lot more like imaginative and wouldn't really go off the path and is so interested in Wonka and the tour. But obviously that scene was worth to have in the film because we got the most iconic moment from the film. You stole fizzy lifting drinks, you lose, good day, sir. They go up to the imagination room. Wonka has a go at Grandpa Joe because he's like, oh, you got your lifetime supply of sweets. It's right there, it's the gobstopper. And Grandpa Joe very interestingly stands up for Charlie. Wonka then sees the imagination in Charlie for a reprise of A Letter from Charlie Bucket, and they go up in the Great Glass Elevator. Also, if I ever start drag, which I probably will, that's my drag name, Elevator. This is where the West End version places Pure Imagination, whereas Broadway and the new UK tour both use a new song, which is called The View From Here. Look, I like the original placement, and I'll tell you why. I think waiting till this moment, towards the end of Act 2, to put in a song that you know, is a very smart move. You sell yourself on your own merits first, and then you give the nostalgia. Pure Imagination is the best song from the original film, and I think it's also the song that fits best with the style of music that was originally written for the West End production. That's why I think this song works best here. The View From Here is fine, but it's not Pure Imagination. Broadway ends the show pretty quickly after this. They land, Wonka explains that he wants Charlie to help run the factory with him, and they set off back into the factory to do their work together. In the UK tour version and the West End version, Wonka leaves Charlie. The West End version admittedly pads this out with the song A Little Me, which I can safely say is the weakest part of the original West End score. It's not needed, it's kind of The UK tour kind of balances this a little bit better, I feel. They land the elevator, Wonka gives Charlie the factory, and then Charlie's family appears. This is where they place another version of Candyman, and Charlie goes back into the factory and they do a little thing like, oh, where's Willy Wonka? And they go, oh, he's fine, he's leaving you to it, you're a good girl, go run your factory, babes. This is where the West End version revealed the twist from the start, Chekhov's homeless man, and they do a really nice magic trick to end out the show where Wonka turns towards the factory and the homeless man just disappears into a pile of clothes onto the floor. The UK tour version, however, has Wonka go into the junkyard that started the show. He takes off his hat and then he leaves through the audience. I mean, it's fine. It works. It's not as impactful, but I do like the symbolism and the idea behind it. And with that, all 3 versions of the show come to a close. So, what have we learnt? I should have picked an easier musical to do this with. I think Broadway is probably my least favourite version, and I think you can probably tell that through what I've said in this video. I appreciate that it goes darker, and it does kind of match the original book with that, but I feel like it's just hinging on the nostalgia of the Gene Wilder film a little bit too much. The things don't really blend well together and it ends up coming off a little bit weird. And I think it misses a lot of what I really enjoy and what I look for in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by shifting a lot of the focus off of Charlie, off of his family, and onto Wonka. The West End version, I think, is very much helped by its budget. It felt like it could go for the bigger ideas and the more out there concepts that were in the original book. These concepts that the Broadway version and the UK tour version have had to kind of slightly work around or do kind of cheap versions of. There's definitely the heart of the story there. But I do think there are a lot of moments and a lot of songs that kind of make the pace feel too long and don't work as well as some others, like the song Simply Second Nature, like the song A Little Me. What it does get right really shines. Personally, I feel about the UK tour version is if you changed 1 or 2 things, just 1 or 2 things, that I have mentioned throughout this video, I feel like it would be the definitive version of this musical. It blends the UK and the US elements that work the best quite well. And I've got to admit, look, even though I'm not the biggest fan of its inclusion in the show altogether, it handles Candyman a lot better than the Broadway version did. And a lot of the other concepts and ideas from the Gene Wilder film. But it's just so interesting to talk about this and see how much this musical have changed, even though it hasn't even been up for a decade yet. But what do you think? Which versions of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory have you seen? Which versions are your favourites? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. If you did enjoy this video, please consider hitting like and subscribing. It really helps me out and helps out the channel. There are some links to some other videos on the screen right now, but that's it for me today and I'll hopefully see you next time. Bye!